This is Brazos Valley Vets, an archive visit with a military veteran from the Brazos Valley. Now, here's your host, Tom Turbeville.
Brazos Valley Voices is very proud of its relationship with the Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial. It's tucked away in College Station's Veterans Park and Athletic Complex at 3101 Harvey Road. It's a hidden gem for sure, a 12-acre site dedicated to veterans from our nation's major wars. The Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial includes life-size statues, a wall of honor, interpretive panels, and memorial sites. It was chartered in 2000 as a nonprofit corporation. The Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial is supported by generous community residents, organizations, and partners, including Brazos County and the municipalities of Bryan and College Station. The Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial's all-volunteer board of directors proudly contributes their time and resources to salute our veterans. Their mission is to proactively pay tribute to veterans through an educational venue where future generations can learn that freedom comes with a heavy price. Former President George H.W. Bush helped dedicate the Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial on November the 10th, 2002. Bush said at the time, "The Brazos Valley community can stand proud. The names that mark the memorial showcase the sons and daughters who gave dedicated service to our nation so that future generations can share the freedoms we enjoy. Their task was great, their sacrifice even greater, but their legacy stands firm, and their memories burn bright." Bush later said the Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial is a similar quality to those at the famed mall in Washington, D.C. Within the Lewis L. Adam Memorial Plaza sits the 250-ton red granite Wall of Honor, which serves as the memorial's focal point. The wall bears the etched names of more than 5,000 veterans representing all periods of U.S. history who are family and friends of Brazos Valley residents. Notable names include 24 presidents and former Texas A&M University students who received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award. The bronze sculpture mounted at the top of the wall depicts a GI carrying a fellow soldier to safety. The statue is the work of artist Robert Eccleston of Schuyler Falls, New York. Do you have a beloved veteran that you would like to add to the Wall of Honor? The veteran may be living, deceased, or active, and does not have to be a Brazos Valley resident. The cost is $150 per name, and the application deadline each year is August the 15th. New additions are recognized at the annual Veterans Day ceremony. Names received after August 15th will be recognized the following year. For more information on adding your loved ones or your name to the Brazos Valley Veterans Memorial Wall of Honor, contact the BVVM at 979-696-6247 or email them info@bvvm.org. Or you can go to their fantastic website. It's easy, bvvm.org. Hello, welcome to another edition of Brazos Valley Voices. I'm Tom Turbeville. Perhaps the most memorable story that I've heard in all of my interviews with so many local veterans in the Bryan College Station and Brazos Valley area was the story of Glenn Morgan, U.S. Navy, World War II. This interview happened on March the 16th, 2005. Glenn Morgan served aboard the USS Indianapolis. He was one of its buglers, as a matter of fact. He was aboard that fateful ship when it was torpedoed and sunk in the Pacific Ocean 30 July 1945 after delivering the parts of the bomb to Tinian Island. Glenn Morgan was one of 317 survivors who floated for 4 days and 4 nights in the Pacific, fighting off shark attack and exposure to survive. This is one of the most remarkable stories of World War II, of Glenn Morgan, survivor of the USS Indianapolis.
Well, where do you want to start? You want to ask the questions and everything?
Well, I to be honest with you, I don't know where to start. I've been looking forward to meeting you for so long since I found out that,
that's nice.
that you lived here, and what a remarkable story that you do have. And tell me a little bit about, obviously, your service to our country. You don't want it to forevermore be boiled down to 5 days in the water. Obviously, your service involved a lot more before the tragedy of Indianapolis. Talk about when you went into the service, what you came out of, where were you, why did you join up, and what your job was. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, it was really interesting because my draft board was in Kansas, and I was waiting to be drafted. I knew I would, but I never got a draft notice, and then it had occurred to me that they might not know where I was. So I wrote them a quick letter, and immediately I got drafted because I was in Southern Illinois at the time. So one of my high school friends and myself and another fellow I didn't know, all three of us were late people to be drafted. And we all got on the train at Salem, Illinois, and went to Chicago. We got off the train at Chicago and went to the Army recruiting, or wherever they were doing this business, which was right uptown. It wasn't far from, I think it was Dearborn Station. And we just walked up, and there were a line of fellows there going through some kind of an inspection. All Army type stuff, and I had seen an officer, a Navy officer, down the hall. And I said, how would you guys like to get in the Navy instead of the Army? And they said, well, I don't see how we can. We were drafted in the Army. And I said, well, let's check and see. So I hastened down the hall and went into this fellow's office and told him our problem. He said, oh, no. He said, you can join anything you want to. He said, you've not signed anything, have you? And I said, no. He said, down those stairs, down a block, turn right, across the street, and he said, there's the naval recruiting station. So we went to this business, and I said, well, we'd like to get in the Coast Guard. I thought that would be pretty clever if I could pull that off. And they said, no, you can't get in the Coast Guard. The idea being that I wouldn't have to leave the States. That's what I thought. They said, no, the Coast Guard's full. But at any rate, after the Marine had made an attempt, I worked for Texaco at the time, and I worked in the engineering department, and they gave me some papers and said, look, they may need your services in the Seabee. So, but I didn't really want to get in the Seabee. So after the Marine came over and did his pitch, and the Seabee guy came over and did his pitch, we all three joined the Navy. And after boot camp, we all went different ways. But the interesting thing, and there was a reason why I was a bugler, simply by accident. So I was trying to do whatever came easy. So in boot camp, I took my cornet from band there in high school, and I would sit and play it in the head, and that's the restroom, because they didn't like for me to play it. And they said, go on and blow that thing some other place. So I was playing it in the head, and this was really better because actually in the head it sounded a lot better. It had a kind of a reverberation to it.
Like singing in the shower.
Yeah, sort of singing in the shower type thing. So some fella came by after a week or two and heard me playing and said, he said, why don't you come over and get in the drum and bugle corps? Well, I said, what does that get me? He said, get you out of a lot of marching. Well, I said, that sounded good. So I did. So I was the company bugler. And I did get out of a lot of marching. I went over and took a little test, and they said, well, that's great. Bugle calls are pretty simple to play. You don't have to push any valves down. So I could read music, there wasn't anything to it. So each night then for our company, I would go outside at night and I would sound the preceding call for taps, which I'd have to meditate and deliberate on right now to think about it. Very, very nice, beautiful call. And once I played this, then I would sound taps every night. So when I returned, I got married on boot leave, and when I returned to Great Lakes, I was rated a second-class bugler. Now that's the same as a second-class seaman, but you did have a rate. Well, I didn't care. I didn't know what it meant. So all of a sudden they sent me around. They said, wait a minute, said, you're going to be placed in ship's company. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, you're going to stay here and help train some people. Well, I thought that was pretty nice, and really it was. I really enjoyed this because we had a drum and bugle corps. Every company, I mean every division up there had a regiment, I think they called them. Every regiment had a drum and bugle corps, and they had contests. And this particular regiment had never even gotten close. So there was another fellow that helped me on this who was a drummer. So we took all the boots and we trained the boots and had to march them the same, because by this time we were proficient in drilling. But we didn't like to do it, so we got out of it by simply going to the commander, regimental commander, and telling him that we thought the boots would do much better if they went back to their companies and only came over to us for a couple hours a day. This worked quite well. And we even wrote a regimental song. The commander says, why don't you guys get a regimental song? And I did. I wrote one. And I can still remember it. It went off quite well, and we taught these guys to sing this in two-part harmony. So every so often I had to go up and sound Morning Colors when it was my turn. So I went up to the main gate, sounded Morning Colors. Every morning, all these people marched in review. All the boots marched in review in front of the commander on this drill field. And as I came back, I heard a drum roll off, and there they were singing the song I'd written. It went over quite well. The guy was pretty impressed, so I made a lot of points. But I never got to stay there, and so when he found out I was being transferred, he said, you didn't tell me you were being transferred. Well, I said, I didn't know it really made any difference. He said, yeah, it does to me. But he said, I can't do anything about it now. So I was transferred to the West Coast and attached to a troop transport. So while they were getting the crew together on Treasure Island, I went to gunnery school. I learned how to fire a 5-inch .38. I could fire it. I could set the range on the projectile and so forth. And they also sent me to fire school to teach us how to control the fire aboard ship. And after I did all this business, it seems that they couldn't get the reduction gears to functioning properly in this troop ship, which was at Bremerton, Washington. So they were trying to get this business fixed up. It was called the General Tasker H. Bliss. And I was be the only bugler aboard this thing. But like I say, I had these other duties too. So all of a sudden I came back from Liberty, and my wife had come out to San Francisco, and they said, hey, you're being transferred. The USS Indianapolis had just come in from Tarawa, which was a pretty bloody operation. And I went aboard at that time. I can't remember exactly when it was. Another bugler from another ship was pulled, and he and I both went together to Mare Island and got aboard this big cruiser. And we wondered what in the world was going to happen to us. And as a matter of fact, at the reunion the other day, Mulvey was a boatswain's mate, first class, and we reported to him. And I remember we went aboard this business. The two buglers that were leaving thanked us for coming and left. One was a Marine bugler. So Mulvey put us, first time I'd ever slept in a hammock. But one night, and then they gave us a bunk. So that was my entrance to the USS Indianapolis. But at any rate, remember, buglers don't just toot the horn. They have to do other things.
Right.
And for some reason, my position was on the bridge. I never got off of the bridge all the time I was on there. So during general quarters, it was my job to go up and relieve the JL telephone talker. Well, this is a guy that has a set of earphones and a little phone on his chest. And it's a sound-powered phone with little carbon granules that wiggle when you talk and send a faint electric current down the line, and there's no outside electricity or power. It generates its own, and they're quite good. They were quite distinct. So every time they had general quarters, this is what I did. I went up and relieved the JL telephone talker. So I'd never done this before, and I didn't know what you were supposed to be doing. Nobody told me. But there were only two of us, and when they would sound general quarters, at that time, both of us stood these watches, 24 hours on and 24 hours off, down in Central Station, which was way down in the bowels of the ship, and there was a huge control, what I want to call it, I'll think of it in a minute, but at any rate, it kept the ship going straight and all this business. Gyro compass, huge big gyro compass set there in Central Station. And we had a loudspeaker there. We just take our bugle and stick it up in the microphone and toot. Then when general quarters was sounded, you climbed the ladder all the way and went all the way to the bridge. I did. The other fellow went to a place called Battle 2. Then I relieved this guy of his telephone. So the first time we had general quarters, I happened to be the one that sounded general quarters. I took my horn, I climbed the ladder from Central Station, went all the way to the bridge, and the ship was pulling out and was out off of San Francisco. I relieved this man of his phones. He gave me a big steel helmet to put over these earphones, great big regular steel helmet. And I waited, and all of a sudden I heard somebody say, "Bridge, this is CIC." Now what we were having was a drill. We had enemy planes coming in. I didn't know this. I didn't know what was going on. And CIC said, this is our radar people, said, "Bridge, CIC is on the line." And I said, "Well, Bridge acknowledges CIC." And about that time, fire control says, "Bridge, fire control is on the line." So I said, "Well, Bridge acknowledges fire control." And all these other people throughout the ship that were attached to this particular telephone system came on the line. A lookout, Battle 2, steering aft. So I stood there, and all of a sudden CIC said, now here was the captain up here and all these people on the bridge. We were standing right out there.
And this is your first time on?
First time.
And they're doing a drill?
And they're doing this drill, headed for Hawaii.
Is this Captain McKay?
No, this was Captain Johnson.
Okay.
He was a little fella, and he was mean. He was good, but he was mean. I thought he was mean. He was tough. He's a little fella. And several things came up later that made me think he was very, very Navy, as were most during World War II. But I stood there, and all of a sudden, CIC said, "Well, look, Bridge, this is CIC. We have a merged plot at 90 miles. And I said, you punch a little button to do this. And I said, "Bridge acknowledges merge plot at 90 miles. And about that time, there's a little space in between, and pretty soon CIC came on again and said, "Bridge, CIC, we have bogeys at 40 miles. I said, "Bridge acknowledges bogeys at 40 miles. I waited a little bit wondering what was happening, and about that time, a lookout came on and said, "Bridge, this lookout, starboard lookout number so-and-so," he said, "we have an unidentified aircraft coming in at 040 or a 20-degree relative bearing." 020 degree. And I said, bridge acknowledges. And about that time, there was a little lieutenant commander that was standing over there, and he'd been watching me. And he walked up to me and he said, sailor, he said, are you hearing anything on those earphones? And I said, aye, aye, sir. He said, have you been reporting it to the captain? I said, is that what I'm supposed to do? He said, you mean you've never done this before? And I said, no, sir. He said, well, look, very congenial fella. And he said, look, let me show you. And he put this thing on, a whole new world opened up. And there he was, going over reporting all this business to Captain Johnson, and Johnson was okay and okay. That's all I had to do was report this business. He said, you got the eye? And I said, aye, sir. I believe I have. And I did. And a whole new world opened up there, and I found out that a merged plot at 90 miles meant that there were friendly and enemy airplanes together. I found out that a bogey was an enemy airplane. And this was quite enlightening, since I didn't know what the heck either one of them was. But from then on, I got the duty of, and I got to talk to everybody. You know, I can remember there was a big tanker that pulled up beside of us, and we were going to take on fuel. It was quite interesting. When they would shoot a line from the bow of our ship to the bow of the tanker, then they would pull a great big hawser, big rope. We don't call them ropes in the Navy. You just don't do that. You don't whistle in the Navy, and you don't call ropes ropes. They're lines. So they pulled this big line over, which they did call a hawser. It was about this big, about 6 or 8 inches in diameter, big thing. And they tied these nose of these two ships together, and they fired over this little gun that shoots these small lines over, and then you pull any bigger line. And they pulled the big hose across that was going to refuel us, and that was the idea. We were going to refuel at sea from this tanker. So the navigation officer comes up and he says, Bugler, tell the tanker that we're getting ready to perform and execute an emergency 90-degree turn to starboard. Now he says, tell them that they're going to have to put on more RPMs, because they'll be expected to keep up with us. And I said, aye, sir. So I told this bird on the other side what was going to happen. And he said, aye, aye. And he passed the word, apparently. I guess he passed the right information. I never did know. But when we executed this, our ship made this big 90-degree turn, but the tanker just went straight ahead. It absolutely could. It probably did try to make a turn. But this huge line just snapped. The next line snapped, and it got to the big oil hose, and it snapped. And oil went all over the Pacific Ocean. But I can always remember this just as clear as a bell. We never performed that maneuver again, needless to say. But these are some of the things that took place aboard ship, besides being sunk and being hit by a suicide plane.
Yeah. Fast forward, if you will, to your mission to transport the bomb, which was obviously a very top secret mission that I guess you all really had no idea what you were doing, right?
Had no idea. We'd been hit by this suicide plane. We had just gotten overhauled, and we were just getting ready to go to San Diego for a shakedown cruise. In fact, I already had my wife planned to go down there. And they told us, this was the first time that the Navy ever told us where they were going, and that we could send our relatives down, should we so desire. And so Murdy Jo decided that she would just go. And all of a sudden, we found out that we were getting ready to sail, went down to Hunter's Point, and picked up this big box, and they put it in the hangar. Had no idea what it was, of course. And then I think they put the uranium, I believe this was uranium-235, but they hid this someplace that I didn't know about. Still don't know where it was. And never really tried to find out, I guess. But the big box was about the size of a standard van, something like that. And it was made out of, I walked by it every day, had no idea. So all the way to Pearl Harbor, when we'd go to chow or something, well, I'd walk by this, or I would go to watch, I'd walk through the hangar. They put it in the port hangar, and it sat there with Marine guards on it, and the wood, I can remember, was real, pretty wood. It was just a big box, and it was screwed together. Apparently it was screwed together. You couldn't see the screws, but whatever it was were countersunk, and red, like sealing wax, was put over it, and flush with the. So I didn't know what that meant. And of course,
I want to make sure you picked it up in California.
Yes, at California.
And you took it to Hawaii, to Pearl Harbor.
Well, we just stopped at Pearl Harbor.
Stopped at Pearl Harbor.
To take on fuel. And then we pulled out of Pearl Harbor. It wasn't long. I don't remember now how long it was.
Okay, so the whole boat was in the hangar.
Huh? The whole bomb was in the bomb was in the hangar.
Okay.
This big box.
Okay.
Yeah, they loaded everything on Hunter's Point there, and
okay.
And I don't remember exactly how they got that thing on, but I saw them take it off. The box was big, and I say we didn't know what was on it because I doubt if we knew what an atomic bomb was anyway. But we had ideas of what it was, and we'd put out in our division that it was the paperwork and the maps for the invasion of Japan, because we fully expected to go into Japan. We'd already made a raid on Japan with our carrier aircraft.
You were expecting the ground war.
Oh, we fully expected to have to go in unless something else was done. And of course we never dreamed of this.
What else was done was right there on your ship.
Right, it was. That was a start. Of course, we didn't have everything, and the bomb couldn't have blown up, of course. But we believe we had the case. Now, this was not the great big, what they call the big boy, but this was the smaller version of this thing. I think one fired off with uranium and one fired off with plutonium. But we set a record going to Pearl Harbor, which, by the way, I believe still stands today. This ship could get up and go. And we were Admiral Spruance's flagship, so every one of these naval operations, with the exception of Peleliu, was made with Admiral Spruance aboard. And he was quite astute and quite dignified. And at any rate, we made this record run, and we went right on down to Tinian to unload this thing. Had no idea what it was, and I guess the captain didn't either. But we pulled in a little, well, it was sort of a harbor there on Tinian, and a barge came out beside the ship. And this ship used to have 2 catapults amidship. And we would shoot these airplanes off of either one of these catapults into the wind. But after we got hit by this suicide plane, they took one of these catapults off. So the catapult came into play in this instance by the fact that the ship was into the wind, and when they rolled the bomb out of the hangar on some 2-inch pipe, I believe it was, they just rolled it across the deck, and they had a chain hoist that they pulled it out of the hangar with, which was fastened. And in this quarterdeck, which was amidship, they had little places they could screw eye bolts into and hook something onto if they needed to do something with. So they hooked the chain hoist on, they pulled us out. And I was up on the bridge after Ian watching this operation. And after they got the bomb pulled out of the hangar, they took this big aircraft crane. This is a crane that we recover aircraft with. When we shoot these planes off the catapult, they had to land in the ocean. We had to reach down the ocean, pick them up, put them back on the ship. So they reached down with this big crane, and they had a big bridle on this bomb box. And as this crane reached down, it had to pick this up, which was of no consequence, but it did have to pick it up and go over this catapult. Whereas the ship had been the other way, they could have just, there wasn't anything in the way. But this didn't really make any difference. The crane could do it and everything. But just as the crane got swung over the catapult and started down, this box shifted in this, I suspect if I'd have had a camera and could have taken a picture of these guys' faces, they'd have been white maybe. But that, it shifted, it didn't fall, of course. I'm sure if it had, that barge would have been gone. But they unloaded it and took it over to the beach, and then we got underway and went down to Guam. And that's when the captain got his orders to go ahead and go to Tinian, or to meet with another ship. I think we were going to have, we'd never had a shakedown cruise after all of this overhaul. We'd got new guns and all this kind of business. New radar equipment, I understand. But they gave the captain the good story that there were no submarines and he wouldn't need an escort. He'd asked for one, I understand. We'd never gone any place without an escort. Now, Admiral Spruance was not aboard at this time. And so I guess they figured that maybe we didn't need, I don't think they really ever thought about that. But nevertheless, we headed out to the Philippines. And I think it was the second night out why Commander Hashimoto found us 2 torpedoes.
What, on the 29th, that was, the torpedo hit sometime after midnight,
Yes.
is that correct?
10 minutes.
Between the 29th and the 30th, it actually
Yep.
hit on the 30th, according to where
Yeah.
you all were
Right.
at the time. What kind of day was the 29th? I read the book, the first part of the book. They said it was
Well, I
a
don't-
beautiful day. That,
Everything was just fine. It was, and I think I had the 8 o'clock. You only had a 2-hour watch there in the evening. I think 4 to 6 or 6 to 8. And I knew we'd quit zigzagging, but I had everybody had maybe in groups, but I myself had the cleaning quarters. I had to keep what they call conning tower clean. It was quite easy to do, and it didn't take me long because generally it wasn't dirty. But it was a it was a place right below the bridge where they had all the controls. They had the big steering wheel, and the steering gear and everything on this ship was, instead of looking like one of these businesses aboard a yacht or something, it was nothing but a big brass wheel, and with a brass pipe looking rim around it, and you just get this business and wheel that business one way or the other. Well, they had one of those businesses down in the conning tower, along with these compass cards, these compass, and there were 2 compasses on each side of the wheel, and you could look at either one, but they were both the same. And then as you made a turn with this ship, you could see this, which direction you were going and everything. And so, as a matter of fact, I was a qualified helmsman. I a lot of times when we didn't have general quarters or anything, I was just on the bridge during my watch. Now, the other buglers stood watches on the bridge when there was nothing else going on, the routine, but they didn't have really anything to do except sound calls when they were asked to sound a call. And they had mail call and this kind of business, chow call and whatever calls. Then if there was an air attack, why then you had one chilling, quite a chilling call that everybody knew. And strangely enough, we never ever sounded abandoned ship. I doubt if anybody really knew what it sounded like, but they knew what air defense was, because it was 2 high notes, and when they heard those, they knew they better get to their air defense pretty quick. But this conning tower was armored, so that if the bridge had to move, since the bridge was open and a strafing attack would leave you open, they could move the watch to the conning tower and do the same thing they did on the bridge. And this was where I was sleeping, and my good friend Ralph Guy, who was a quartermaster. Now, the buglers and the quartermasters, there were 23 of us all together in this division, and we were in called the Navigation Division, or the NAN Division. and we all operated together. So the quartermaster and I were sleeping in conning tower because it was cool, and we had little rubber life preservers that you blew up with a little hose. Some of them had little cartridges, but the one I had blew up with a hose, and I had it partially blown to sleep on as a pillow. We just put a mattress cover down on the deck and slept on the deck, and it got to be quite comfortable. It was better than sleeping in a hot sack, since the ships were not air conditioned.
Right.
And it would get pretty hot down in the compartment. So fortunately, that's where I was. So the minute that this huge just blew you off the deck almost, and there we were way up high from this thing, but the jar was just tremendous. I immediately took a red flashlight and looked at my watch, and it was 10 minutes after midnight, just right on the nose. And Ralph said, "What in the world happened?" And I said, "I don't know." By this time, the portholes were open, and smoke was beginning to pour in from the forward part of the ship. And I said, "Well, I don't know, maybe a magazine." Never dreamed we would have been torpedoed. Wasn't looking for anything like this. So I thought, well, maybe a magazine blew up, and I mentioned this. And in fact, I guess they think maybe it did from the torpedo. But the idea was I had a watch that was certainly not waterproof. And my wife's mother had given me a real nice Elgin watch that I had put in my locker. I didn't want to wear it. And I purchased a watch from a sailor, and he said, "Now watch it. When you pick it up, it'll fall apart, but it keeps good time." So the reason I mentioned this was that the next day, when I looked at my watch, it had stopped at 20 minutes after 12. So 10 minutes had gone by from the time that I looked at my watch till I hit the water. Now the ship was not under yet, but when they say 12 minutes, that's pretty accurate, I would say. And that not under yet, but when they say 12 minutes, that's pretty accurate, I would say. And that's how come me to know.
This is the watch that was on your wrist.
This is the watch that was on my wrist, yeah.
The one that
it was
apart,
completely,
but it kept good time.
Kept good time. And obviously water infiltrated and filtered into this thing pretty quick. So when I took it apart, I just took it apart and pitched it over it. It was all gummed up. I mean, in that short of time, salt water just didn't do too much good for it. But we did know what time it was out there. And I got off the ship in a kind of a unique way, because when this thing hit, Ralph said, "Should we go to the bridge?" And I said, "Yes, we better." So by this time, this thing was canting quite rapidly. And the ladder that we went to the bridge with, there were two ways. There was a more step business ladder on the after end of the bridge. But to get out of conning tower and go straight to the bridge, there was a vertical ladder right there, just a steel ladder. But by this time, it was laying in a negative fashion. That is, it was kind of hard to hang on, and because you wanted to fall away from it. But both of us made it up, and somebody hollered, and we thought they were hollering for me, and he said, "I believe somebody's hollering for you." And I went to the forward part of the bridge. By this time, the deck was about maybe 45 degrees. So I walked up to the high side, and there stood the other bugler that was on watch, because we hadn't had any general quarters or anything. It was just a routine watch that was on when this hit us. And Lieutenant Orr, who was quite an astute fellow, was very calmly hollering over the side with a megaphone to throw all the life rafts over. Well, by the time I'd gotten up there, they'd already decided to abandon ship. And I said, "Well, Lieutenant Orr, are we to abandon ship?" And he said, "The word has just been passed." So I asked old Donald Mack, he was at the reunion, by the way, if he was going to sound abandon ship. He said, "Just as soon as I get the order." but nobody ever gave it to him. So, not thinking too clearly about my good friend, I said, well, Lieutenant Orr, I'll see you later then. And I crawled over the side of this railing on the bridge and actually jumped into the second deck down, which was a signal deck, which protruded a little bit, and there was an alidade, or one of these, was a spyglass with a compass card on it. In other words, it would look through this business and you could tell where the other ship was and read a bearing on this thing, because it was always a relative type thing. So I jumped down, I could see this, and I jumped between this alidade and this signal bridge banister, and I did all right then because I realized I didn't want to hurt myself. But Ralph never followed me. He thought that was probably pretty stupid. Not only that, he was not a real athletic fellow. Never saw him again. Felt bad about the whole thing because I didn't. He may have talked me into going with him too. So I don't know. Maybe what I did was best, for me at least. But at any rate, I crawled over the signal bridge. And you got to understand, this thing was already beginning to lay down on its side and go under by the head. And clear as a bell, I can remember I came down the side of this flat metal part into the 40mm gun mount. Now this gun mount is actually quite a ways above the water ordinarily. So I knew that the whole bow of the ship was under, and apparently doing just what they said later, scooping up water, because the ship never stopped moving. You don't stop one of those businesses very quick when you're talking about 10,000 tons of metal floating along there. So as the water caught me and pushed me up against the breech of one of these 40mm gun mounts, it pushed me against it, and then all of a sudden it seemed like it released me a little bit. But nevertheless, the water was beginning to, the gun was going down. The ship by this time was actually laying on its side. And as my little rubber raft life belt began to buoy me up, I grabbed the gun, and I had the sensation that I was going up the barrel of this gun. Of course, obviously the gun was sinking and I was staying at the same place. But I can remember it had a flash funnel on it. I believe that's what they call these little funnels on the end of these things. And I can remember my hands going over that, and there I was, free of the ship, so I swam away as fast as I could. I watched it sink. I watched the stern go up in the air. I watched the big propellers, or screws, still turning. And I watched this thing plunge, and if you ever saw the movie Titanic where the hind end stuck up, that's exactly what this did. It went up in the air and plunged. And I'd always heard that if you could get sucked under. I don't see how you could. The boiling water came up, air came up from this thing. All the air that was trapped in the various little nooks and crannies, I presume, burst forth and came up and boiled, and the water out there has a lot of phosphorus in it, and you could see it was white, just glowed. And there our old ship was gone.
Where were you right then?
Well, I was off of this bubbles of air. I was away. I'd already did the Australian crawl away from the thing. And then I looked.
Did you have on a life jacket?
No, I didn't. Actually, what had happened was we went to the after end. When we went up on the bridge, we didn't immediately go forward. Ralph said, let's go get a life jacket. We had a wire that hung from the after end, because this was our stations all the time. And we had Kapok life jackets up there, besides these little inner tube things. And you couldn't, you had to wear these little inner tube businesses all the time, because you couldn't eat chow without having one on. It was a routine to keep on all the time. So the minute that we got up, the blast hit us, I just hooked it around my waist. But we went aft to get this, and there was not one hanging there. They were all gone. Somebody had gotten Ralph's and had gotten mine. Well, this didn't really bother us, so we didn't think too much about it, or I didn't at the time. And it wouldn't have made any difference had I had this little belt on or not. It was swimming came so naturally that it just wouldn't have made any difference. But I did. I struck out for an airplane that I could see. So we have an airplane on a catapult. Always stayed there during good weather. If it was real rough, they'd take it and put it in the hangar. But they had this airplane. And this was a new type airplane. This was called a Curtiss SC, which was an underwing plane, and that had a little dihedral business on it. And I remember the cowling looked like a P-47 Thunderbolt, because the cowling was egg-shaped, oblong, and the crankshaft through the propeller wasn't in the center of the thing.
Was that the airplane you're talking about? Is that what would be called a PBY?
No. This was one of our spotter planes, and we used to have 4 of them. And when we got hit with a suicide plane, they went back and they revised this thing and they put these Curtiss SCs on. In fact, the pilots had to go and learn to fly these things again.
Okay.
They were a little more powerful, a little speedier, and had a little more armament. So one of these was sitting on there. It's a low-wing plane instead of a biplane, and I could see it. It had been fairly dark, but I'd been asleep, and it had been fairly dark, I guess, but I could see the moon in an overcast, and it was sort of an eerie glow-like, and I could see this plane.
Now you're in the water now.
Oh yeah, I'm in the water.
You're swimming.
You've
got your little inner tube.
I got the inner tubes holding me up. Yeah, I could stop and rest, but like I say, I could have done it anyway. But
right.
I saw the plane. Fact is, to swim with the thing on actually hindered you. But now remember, I still had my shoes on. I would have, if I'd have had to swim without anything, I'd have probably kicked my shoes off some time back. I'd put my shoes on when this thing hit. Right afterwards, and
but you see the plane, and it's in the
well,
water.
I could see the plane, and I thought, oh, boy, what a neat thing. I'll go get up on the plane. And I couldn't fly one at that time. I probably couldn't fly one of those now even, but at any rate, I swam to the plane, and as I got to it, it was beginning to cant. And fortunately for me, there was a life raft right there underneath the tail. And I could see the plane was sinking. Apparently, when this thing hit, the pontoon was fastened to the catapult business in some way. I didn't know how it was fastened, but obviously it has to stay on there till they're ready to shoot it off. So apparently this had broken through the metal on the pontoon, and the plane sank. I was afraid it was going to pull this life raft under, and I actually stuck my foot out of the water, and the stabilizer was coming down, and I could see it, and I thought it was going to hit inside the raft and pull the raft under, so I just, hanging on the side at the end of the raft, I just stuck my foot up and caught the tail and pulled the raft away and crawled in, and there was another raft right beside it I didn't see.
Was there anybody else around you?
Heads were beginning to pop up then, but I couldn't see who they were, and they were all covered with fuel oil, black. We were all black, and with this fuel oil. So the next raft, I got in this raft and reached over to this other raft, and I tied this little hank of line. They had little hanks. I tied this together, and a few more people came in. There it is.
The answer to that. Okay, so were these 3-man rafts? Are they?
No. These rafts are about.
How many they designed?
Oh, they'd hold 6 easy enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
so you're in one raft and you're trying to save the other one.
yeah, I tied it together, and 2 or 3 people crawled in, Had no idea who they were. You couldn't see, and nobody said very much. And then somebody pointed to a black blob. Now remember, there were cries for help, but all of a sudden this quit. There was nothing else that we could see except this one little black blob sitting over here, and it became obvious that this was a life raft of some sort. And it did. It turned out to be two, but lobbed on top of another. They were partially lobbed on top, and there were three people in this. So we would holler at each other and say, well, paddle this way and we'll get together. And we did. We had all four rafts in, all tied together in a big rectangular shape, and with space in between where they could move apart. And everybody sort of got over in the different rafts and equalized everything up. And that's where we spent all our time. Very fortunate, but all the time we were there, you couldn't believe that we thought that we were the only survivors.
Is that what you all look like?
Yep,
right there.
that's it.
Okay, because that's four rafts.
I don't know
if that's you.
Don't know. I doubt if it's me.
I
No.
wonder if that's your four rafts tied together there.
No. Actually, I'm sure it wasn't. We were picked up. Some of the last picked up by the Ringness. Some of the guys had to have help getting up. Some were. We had this one fellow that was burned. We lost Lieutenant J.G. Freeze. Died about the second day, and he was apparently burned. We didn't know he was. He spoke articulately enough. Came out a porthole, he said. But by the evening of
he was on one of your.
He was in the raft next to me, yeah. And they had some Kapok life jackets over in this raft, and he was laying on these in the water. You lay in the water in these rafts. You're not up high out of the water. You just sit down in the water and up to your navel generally when you're just sitting there. But they keep you afloat, and probably in rough weather they could handle some pretty rough waves, I imagine, as long as you hung on to them. But Lieutenant Freeze died, and they decided to see if, actually rigor mortis had set in the next morning. They couldn't find a pulse. They wanted one of us to come over. I didn't want to do it. And so they took his clothes, and I mean, I don't think they took his clothes, took his watch and his ring, and they just slid him over. I couldn't look. Well, like I say, I was over in the next raft. But we were all together there. And the next day, not another soul in sight. Nothing, no debris, nothing.
This is when dawn broke the next morning.
Yes. And then everybody began to get sick. We didn't know we'd swallowed fuel oil, and we didn't think anything about sharks. My goodness, there's a lot of sharks in the middle of the ocean. But the weather was fairly rough that morning. It was white capping a little bit, and somebody in one of the other rafts had let what I thought was a can of pyrotechnics go, flares. And I said, well, who let that go? And somebody said, well, it was an accident or something. And I said, well, I'll just go get it. So I started taking my shoes off, and the fellow sitting next to me, who turned out to be a real leader in this thing, said, well, wait a minute, Morgan. He said, look out there. And there was that classic fin going through the water that you see when you say shark. He said, go if you want to. But what was happening, this little old light can wrapped up in canvas, they were all in a little canvas-like business, and you had to kind of work to get them open, was just floating away in the wind because it was traveling much faster than we could travel. So it was just drifting away, and I didn't want to let anything go. But I did. I said, well, I'll forego that then. And
yes, sir. I'm sure you did.
So I let that go. But yeah, we weren't really bothered with sharks like the fellows in the water. The fellows in the water really had a lot of trouble.
Now,
And
I want to get a picture of this. A certain number of people of the 1100 and whatever
1176.
Died with the attack, with the sinking of the ship, I would suppose, or they were burned. Is that right?
They thought perhaps as many as 800 got off, and some were burned.
Okay. So as many as 800 got on.
That's their guess. They didn't really know.
And these 800 were either, like you, either on rafts, hanging on giraffes,
Or had
in life
K-Pop
jackets,
life jackets.
or life jackets, but they were, and that's how they spent the first night.
They spent the first night, and the guys in the life jackets spent the next 4 nights,
Right.
or even 5 nights. I think they said 5 nights. I couldn't remember how many nights there were, but
Now,
we
the
all
first-
spent the same amount.
The first sharks started to appear.
Well,
the
for
next
those
day,
people,
or-
I can't talk for the people that were in the, I only know the accounts that they had, but the very first day was this shark. And strangely enough, I have no idea if it was the same shark or not.
Right.
But we were very fortunate. I was fortunate that I happened to pick this bunch of life rafts, or that I had seen the airplane, because a lot of people never saw this plane. And of course, when the plane fell off, I was quite a distance from it by the time the ship actually sunk. But I just looked back, I could look around to see what I could see. But I saw the silhouette of this airplane. And that's why I came back to it. So fortunately for me, these rafts were here, and they were very well provisioned. And these rafts are all supposed to have water and everything on them, and the deck divisions occasionally go by and change water. I don't think they'd changed the water in this for maybe several years, but the water was fit to drink at any rate. It wasn't salty. But they were little wooden kegs full of water. And then they had a big can that had Spam can, just regular Spam around it, and tucked inside, along with other malt tablets and this kind of business. And so we rationed this stuff. We rationed the water. And we had little glasses of water. We had little tin cups that had 6-ounce marks marked in them. And we would pour in 3 ounces in the morning and 3 ounces in the afternoon. So we were pretty well fixed up for food and everything, considering. And nobody was really hungry. That was another thing. But with the Spam and with little round cookie-looking businesses, we would make a sandwich. And there was 9 or 10 little pieces of slices of ham of Spam that you could cut off of these things. And when we would throw the Spam can with its juice in it and everything into the water, is when this shark would come in close. He sort of liked this business, and he would come in and snoop around pretty close, and so we got to calling this shark Charlie. Now, I'm assuming it's the same one every day, but it looked like the same size. He was big. Don't know what kind he was, but he was kind of an olive green looking on top and white on bottom. And we never really paid much attention to Charlie. We just called him Charlie until one day I was watching this old shark, and we just got through throwing a Spam can in, and Charlie began to come in, and he headed right for the raft, and I was sitting on the edge. Now, everybody can't sit on the edge of one of these rafts at the same time because it pushes it down in the water. Mm-hmm. But when you're sitting in the water, your buoyancy of most of your body it helps the raft. And so I was sitting on the edge at this time, and I said, well, look at old Charlie. And I just slid in as he got closer. And he came up to the edge of the raft, which, of course, the edges are just not very far above the water line. And his head came up and slid right up on the raft, just momentarily slid back in. He never tried to bite. Now, I didn't offer him my finger or anything, but he slid back in. I have no reason, or I have no idea why. He just did it. But he never did get violent or anything. Now, they can, because one of my good friends happened to be with the group of rafts that was with the captain. And he was a quartermaster too. But he was telling me he had one of these kits have a fishing gear business, so you can clean your fish. And it's just a little old wooden handle knife with a little blade that sticks down a couple of inches is all. Sort of square-like and tapered. And Luke said this big shark came up in between the raft, and he said he just stabbed it in the top of the head, and he said it just tore up everything trying to get out of there. Didn't bite anybody or anything, or try to get into rafts or anything. But the captain apparently got somewhat dismayed with Luke's action. Luke said, well, you know, he kind of got, they knew each other. Luke was a quartermaster, and we all knew the captain because we stood on the bridge with him all the time. But he did get a little angry. But otherwise, the only shark, there were a lot of other sharks. You could look down in the water and see sharks look like little sharks. Now, whether they were little sharks or whether they were way deep, I don't know. Only Charlie was the one that came up and stayed around us all this time. As far as I know, he was there all the time.
How spread out were you all? I mean,
they told
like
us.
In the daylight, could you look out and see other
Oh
rafts
no,
floating?
no. There was. We thought we were the only survivors.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. The next day there was not another soul inside. Lieutenant, I shot the flares. In fact, I have the last red flare. These flares look like a shotgun shell, a 10-gauge shotgun shell. And you fired these things in daytime. They're just a little puff of smoke. You couldn't see them very far. Night, they look like a Roman candle. And you got one shot Roman candle type thing. I think there was red, and I believe there was a green, and I think there was white. And we had several of these, and a little mechanism that you'd slide. It wasn't like one of those pistols you see in the movies that you fire this pistol and everything. It was a little mechanism you would slide this shell in and pull a little gadget from the bottom and hold it up, and it would shoot. Just like you'd hold a Roman candle up and shoot it. But you had to pull this little plunger and let go. So Lieutenant Freeze wanted to shoot. He was a senior in command at that time.
Of your group?
Of our group, until he passed away. Well, he was quite coherent the first day. And he wanted to shoot a lot of these in the daytime, and I said, well, I'll shoot a couple, but I said, we really need to save them for night, I would think. And he agreed. And then, so we didn't shoot any more in the daytime. Just a couple. Just a puff of smoke is about all you could see. Nobody would see them from the air very far. No.
But at nighttime you shot them.
Oh yeah, at nighttime. Well, we shot the first night but we didn't shoot them when we didn't see anybody. We shot for some the first night. We didn't shoot any from the first night from midnight on after we got sunk till daybreak, because first place we didn't know what we had.
Right.
And we didn't shoot those until the next night. But we found them that day, and then he wanted to shoot them because he died about the second night. And I didn't know there was anything the matter with him, except in the afternoon and the sun was setting. I looked across and smiled at him, and I knew Lieutenant Freeze. I knew most of these people that stood deck watches on the bridge because I was there with them. And of course we weren't bosom buddies or anything like that. But Lieutenant Freeze was a nice enough fella, and he came out of porthole, he said, and he looked just like he had a severe sunburn. He only had his shorts on. But that evening of the second night there, when he looked across, it just looked like he was out of it. You know, I spoke to him and he didn't speak back. And he just laid down and died. And somewhere around 11 o'clock that night, a guy by the name of Fred Hart, he was a second-class radarman. Second class means you're second-class petty officer. And he said, I believe one of you guys come over here and see if you can feel this guy's pulse. Now, I only had 3 guys in this raft at that time. We hadn't moved all these people out of these other rafts and got situated. But Fred couldn't feel any pulse, and somebody said, well, let's just leave him there. In fact, I did. I said, won't you just leave him, and we can tell in the morning. Nothing you could do. So in the morning, that's when they determined he'd passed away, and they slipped him overboard.
But when you were shooting these flares at night, no one else was shooting any flares that you could see?
No, the last night we saw one. We saw one way on the horizon.
On the last night?
The last night, but we'd already knew that we were going to be picked up.
Right.
And that's when we said, well, by golly, we believe somebody else is there. So actually on the 4th evening, my friend in this raft, Ken Lanner, was a signalman. And everybody was dejected and not saying anything. And, you got to where you weren't the best of friends. Guys would get grouchy, you know. And but old Ken was sitting there, and he said, "Hey, Morgan." Now, I didn't know Ken before. I knew he was a signalman, and he's on the deck below me, and I'd pass him occasionally, say hello. But he wound up being in this next raft to where I could just talk to him. And he said, "Look down there." The sun was setting in the west. And look down there on the horizon, he said, and tell me what you see. He said, "Is that a bird?" And I looked down there, and yeah, I said, "I believe that must be a bird." And about that time, a little flash of light came off of it. And it looked like a little black dot going back and forth. Later, we found what looked like was going back and forth was they were making circles. And of course, from our angle, it just looked like they were going back and forth. So when that glint of light came off, I said, "Gee, I believe that's an airplane." And by this time, the other fellows began to kind of perk up. And so we felt like that we were going to be picked up. Maybe
What
that.
day was this?
I think that was about the evening of the
Okay.
fifth night, I guess it was. Well, we was only out there, I believe, 4.5 days and 5 nights. I can't even remember that part, but I know that this was evening and going into the evening of the night that we didn't get rescued till the next day, till noon the next day.
Mm-hmm.
But after seeing this plane, we were enthusiastic and came to life, you might say. So that then as it got dark, blue searchlights stabbed the sky, just completely, they were just going all over the place. Then we knew that they were trying to let us know that help was on its way. And all of a sudden there was a blinker light up in the sky, and there was an airplane. We couldn't see the plane, we could see the light. And so old Ken took his flashlight. We had flashlights in this thing. And he blinked this airplane, and you could see the airplane blinking back. I said, "What do you say? What do you say?" He said, I said, "What do you send?" He said, "I sent SOS." And I said, "What this guy said?" Said, "Roger Wilco." Well, I said, "What else?" And he said, "That's all." He's now not blinking anymore. And never saw him again. So it wasn't until the next morning when the wind came up and we ran into 2 rain squalls. And I know the water got pretty rough in these squalls. We actually caught water. Caught water in one of these big 4 by 8 foot canvases, and we couldn't drink it. It was salty. It was just brackish enough you couldn't drink it. But we washed this canvas out with our hands and folded it up and tried to keep it out of the salt water. And sure enough, we ran into another rain squall. Another rain squall, and we did catch water. So we were one of those groups that just were more fortunate than the rest, I feel like.
I'm going to stop you real quick because I want to change. I don't want to be sitting here and run out. I got 4 minutes.
Where were we?
I was doing. Huh? You're doing fine.
We were at the rain squall. We had fresh water. Yeah, we did. Yeah, we had some fresh water, and we all took a little drink of it. Actually, you just didn't seem to be that thirsty. I don't know whether you soak up water, but we had this other water that kept us going. And I figured that maybe, I actually was not beginning to think we were going to get picked up. And I wasn't that concerned. And one of the things that was so disastrous was the fact that we'd all swallowed fuel oil.
And you were getting sick?
Oh, the first day, and I didn't mention it while I was going through this little narrative, but not only did you get sick, but you couldn't see, your eyes began to burn. And I would sit and spit in my hands and wipe my eyes, just burn like fire. And then I would stand up and you're not real stable out there. When I thought I was in great shape and was athletically superior.
How old were you on this day?
Oh, I was probably 20 when this happened. But when you stood up, you couldn't look, or you'd look around the horizon, but standing up didn't seem to put you any higher. You just couldn't see over the next wave, it seemed like. But you'd look around hoping for help was coming or something. You'd see something. Never saw a thing. We saw airplanes way off occasionally. We had little flashing mirrors, little mirrors. Well, I had one, it was a little signaling type mirror. And you had to be kind of proficient with it to use it. But there was a way, and if you read the directions, it was easy enough to do. But the fuel oil that we all swallowed, and I guess everybody must have got as much as me, but it would make you vomit. And so for some almost 12 hours, you would sit there and you just get so sick, you just want to go ahead and die. That's how sick it made you. And this black oil would come up, and then you just dry heave, and you dry heave. No more oil would come up, but you'd still get sick. So finally, sometime in the later part of that afternoon, just before dark, I heaved, and green material came up, some kind of bile, right out there in the water in front of you. And I thought, oh my, what's happening to me now? But you know, a strange thing was I began to feel quite well. It was such a relief because I was no longer ill. And you almost felt joyful to think that that you were finished with that part of this episode. But your eyes still burn, and sometime during the next day this began to fade away, and you could keep your eyes open without those things just open or shut. They just drive you crazy. So you can imagine what these people in life jackets all this time, how any of them survived was a miracle. And whether or not, I often wonder if I'd been in their shape, could I have made it? I always felt like I could, but you never know how you'll react to some of this kind of business. But after this was over, it really was not that bad. And as a matter of fact, we had what they call a floater net, and this floater net was rolled up, and the first night a guy came up paddling up to the raft on top of this floater net, and he was riding it just like a cigar and paddling it, laying down on it on his stomach. And as he came up to the raft, I tied the floater net to the corner where I was sitting, and I said, well, come on in. No, he said, I'll ride this out till morning. And he stayed on this till daylight, and then he came on. So we had this floater net tied up all the time, and for a couple of days it would just come up and bump the raft, and if I was sitting up on it, it'd come up when I least expected it and poke me in the hind end, in the back sort of. So finally I said, well, does anybody else want to take the floater net and tie it on there? He said, if you want to just cut it loose. And I hated to cut it loose. So what we did then, I said, well, after Lieutenant Freeze died, we had a guy by the name of J.J. Moran. And he, by the way, is the guy that was in the book called All the Drowned Sailors. Was a picture of him in there getting the Purple Heart, and I'm the one standing next to him. And he was with me, and he was a first-class radioman, and he was in command after Lieutenant Freeze died, and he took command. This guy did it. He initiated the water rationing, and initiated the spam rationing, initiated everything, and said, this is the way we're going to do it, and we won't let anybody else go any other way. And they did find some guy that was drinking water in one of the other rafts secretly, but they had kind of a little mock court-martial, and they cleared that up pretty easy. But old J.J. Moran, and the strange thing about it, this fella got killed 7 months later, accidentally electrocuted.
Is that right?
So he and I became good friends, but I didn't know him. He was in the radio group, and I said, well, he said, I got a message out, at least. We should be picked up tomorrow. And each day we thought we'd be picked up. But old JJ said, I got the message out. And I said, yeah, well, just exactly how do you know you got out? You're sitting there tapping this key, right? And he said, that's right. Well, I said, just because you tapped a key, how do you know this thing radiated off the antenna? Well, he said, Morgan, I'm smart enough to know whenever the damn thing is sending a signal. Well, I said, how? He said, because I got a big needle there. Later, I understood the process. So on emergency power, he sent the signal. Now, he said, where anybody got it or not, who knows? But JJ was a good man, and we finally, I said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we take the floater net and push it underneath the raft and maybe it'll lift us up? Well, he said, we can try. Well, we couldn't get anybody in our raft enthusiastic to do this. And we did try it. And they kind of cursed me out because they didn't want to get up and have to do it. But maybe we could have done it had a person got in the water and gone under the raft and pulled this thing up underneath this thing. But we couldn't make it stay under there by just sticking it there. But it had floater rings on it, and that's what it was called, a floater net. So when you unrolled it in the water, it made a big rope net full of little round floating discs strung throughout the thing. And so we left it laying flat out in the water, and I was sitting there looking at the thing, and I said, look, why don't we...
At this point in my conversation with Glenn Morgan, my tape ran out. I was able to finally come up with some other tape, but by now we had changed subjects a little bit. So the crux of the conversation you've already heard, but there's still more to come, quite a bit more to come of the conversation that went in somewhat different directions. But we'll just let you listen. Right now we're picking it up talking about a TV movie that had been made about this experience, and then we pick it up with other things. So I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you continue. We'll continue.
To really do it this time. They made the sorriest movie with this.
There was one that was not good.
CBS,
right?
Yeah, it was called Mission of the Shark. It was poor, and but
yeah, this is something that deserves something on the order of Private Ryan. Or
this is what they're talking about.
Yes.
They're talking about this one being a big one. So how they're going to do this and exactly what kind of how they're going to make a storyline out of this, I have no idea. But they, believe me, they can do some wondrous things.
Right.
Now with the technology, they can probably show this thing or depict the sinking of this thing, kind of like the Titanic. They can make this thing look real and everything.
Right. What were your, during this whole ordeal, what were your personal thoughts about death? Did
Well,
you think you were going to die, or do you think I'm not going to do this thing?
You know, we did a lot of praying, but I can tell you this, that I had read stories about people surviving for 3 months.
Right.
Perhaps not in one of this type of life raft. But I didn't see why we couldn't, because I didn't tell you this, but one of the fellas found out how to catch fish. I couldn't do it. I sat on the end of this thing, and the Navy had this kit. It was nothing but a white rag with hooks and string stuck in the hooks and tied to the hooks. The hooks were stuck in the cloth, and there was a red and green yarn in this thing with dried up bacon rind, and one little dip net that was folded up like you would dip goldfish out of a bowl. And I tried my hand at this thing. I stuck a piece of bacon on the hook, and boy, there's a lot of fish out there. Fish would come up, and you could just see them, but they didn't want anything to do with this thing. So the first thing I knew, I quit, and I said, "Out of heck with it." So there was a young kid in that raft that hadn't been to sea. He just about got on this thing when it got sunk. And he was laying down in the water in this other raft with his arm over the edge of the raft, real nonchalant. And we'd rationed everything, but we had cans of malt tablets for some reason that I didn't know about, but I didn't care about chewing them up. They made you thirsty. But he chewed one of these up and spit it in the water, and there was a little purple fish that came up in between the rafts and would gobble up this little gob of blob of spit and malt tablet. And this guy was sitting there poised to catch this sucker. And I watched this guy make a few passes. That little fish always came back. Well, I guess it was the same one. It always came back to gobble this up. He liked that. And I just made the statement. I said, I don't believe you're ever going to catch that fish. And he said, well, I don't care. He said, what else I got to do? I thought that made sense, and by golly, he did. He caught that thing. And my good friend Ken Lantner from Georgia, that was at the meeting the other day, diced this up, and this guy caught some big, long silverfish. Don't know what they were, but they were good.
Yeah.
So we caught 4 of these. He diced a little mirror in the back, and you would put it in that little, and try to line it up with that little clear space, a clear cross in the mirror. Then when you took your eye and you actually looked at what object in the sky that you wanted it to go to, once you lined the 2 crosses up and could still see this object through this clear glass, theoretically you were, now you couldn't send SOS with this thing. This would be silly. There's no way. Just getting the flash to heading that way was the main thing. So what I'd practice it. You could do it with a guy sitting on the end of the raft. And I would sit there and pull this thing up and learn how to use it, and I could put it right on him. I could do this pretty good. Of course, you don't have that when you're trying to aim up in the sky. So I knew how to use it pretty good. So the last morning when we saw this plane, it was a PB Ventura. Why, everybody had one of these little, I had it hanging on a string on the corner of my raft, so I just pulled it out of the water and aimed at this plane, and this plane quit making those circles way over there. Now this was the last morning, and came right straight over us. So we never found out if he actually saw the signals. I often wondered who they were and did they see the flash, because they quit searching way on the horizon and came right straight over us. Threw out a dye marker, a green dye marker, and then a PBY came over, and we thought, well, he'll land. No, it wasn't the one that landed on the water the night before. This guy just flew over pretty low, and they waved at us out of the blister and flew on. So we sat there till noon, and one of the guys said, and I remember when we got picked up, somebody did a backflip off the back of that raft. And I said, by golly, I never told very many people this, but I was amazed that he remembered that part, because that's what I did. I said, boy, if we get picked up, I'll do you guys a backflip off of this raft. Of course, it was not the greatest backflip in the world, but but it was. And in fact, that was the only time that I'd gotten out of that raft. So I crawled back in.
Charlie was gone by then.
That morning, this other fellow that was burned, he had skin hanging. This was a shearer.
Yeah.
Has never come back. He said, I've called him several times to try to get these different people that haven't come to come to our reunion. We'd love to see them. But he said, no. He said, I'm not healthy enough to come. And he said, I remember absolutely nothing of what happened, and I don't want to.
And you've got to respect that.
You bet. You bet.
From people.
You really do.
People,
His skin, he had skin. He sat there,
right.
never moaned, never griped or anything, with this skin hanging off his arm. Ken Lantner and I, we pulled the raft together. We had bandages. We had first aid kits, all soaking wet and full of fuel oil, except when you unrolled the bandages far enough, you could get some clean bandages, even though they were wet. So we they had a bottle of mineral oil in this kit. We took this mineral oil, and I just poured the mineral oil on his arms and let it run. And old Ken took this bandage and took that skin, it was hanging down, and wrapped this thing. The only thing this guy did, the last day he jumped out of the raft and they had to pull him back in, we brought him over into our raft, which was high and dry. And this is another thing that old Moran did. When they got Shearer back in their raft, now remember these rafts, you're sitting up in water, and he was just sitting there shaking. He jumped in for some reason, and they pulled him back. He went out of his head. So Moran says, look, he said, let's put this guy over here, he said, because he's going to get pneumonia. So let's get him over. Well, our raft was loaded. So he told one of these fellas to get over in the other raft, and he said, no, wait a minute. He said, why don't you and Morgan get over there? And JJ said, well, look, you get your can over there. And he said, Morgan and I'll spell you off. We shot this guy full of morphine. I didn't, but Ken Lanner did. And we had little morphine syrettes in this thing. And he popped this Sherry with this thing, and he just laid down on this canvas and went to sleep. And when the plane came over, we tried to waken him. He did. He kind of woke up, and I said, come on, Harold. I said, we're going to be rescued. And sure enough, at noon, somebody said, hey, look. And there was the radar of a little ship coming over the horizon, heading right for us. And they pulled right up beside our raft. They'd already picked the captain up. They'd already picked the group up. And they stopped by us and backed down, threw over this big cargo net, and all of us that could crawled up this thing and got in, and the fellas were great. They stripped their clothes off, and I took my one red flare, missed the little shooting gun, but I know who's got it. He showed it to me, so it's here. I had the mouthpiece from my bugle, or my horn, in my pocket, so I've got that. I've still got the black web belt that I wore off the ship. It's still full of fuel oil, greasy looking. I've still got that at home. But they stripped us off and gave us a darn good meal, and were great. And so I go to their reunion. I've been to 3 of them. They made me.
How often do they have them?
Once a year they have one. They're going to have this next one in Springfield, Missouri.
And you have it on the anniversary, or close to the anniversary?
No,
is that when you have it, or?
No, they have theirs whenever they want to have it. It's their reunion, and it's not really associated. It's just that they were involved in this epic,
right.
and feel like that we're sort of a part of their tour of duty at that time.
But your Indianapolis reunion, you have that every year?
No, we used to have it every 5 because it's a humongous thing to get together.
Certainly.
And we have, remember...
How many of the 316 are still alive? Do you have?
We got just about 130 that's still alive, and there was 80 that came to this thing. Some in wheelchairs, and they'll come.
So more than half of those that are still alive came this last time.
Yeah.
Now, your particular rescue, how were you rescued? Was it by a boat?
Well, the ship pulled up beside us. The Ringness, APD 100, pulled up right beside us and dropped this cargo net, and we just crawled on.
I see. Okay.
And then they took us to the hospital on Peleliu, which was
this the hospital, the Tranquility? Did you go?
No,
to that?
I was on the hospital Tranquility, but we didn't get on that until they took us to Guam. So they picked up the. My good friend Harrison passed away there on Peleliu. I went over to see him, but they told me he wasn't going to make it. He was still alive. And I felt...
He was one, I believe I read in the book that there were only 2, is that right? 2 of who had survived who later died in the hospital.
This was one of them.
Right?
Yeah,
I believe
Harrison.
You said that there were only 2.
Yeah. He was a little older fella, and his good friend, we were all good friends. In fact, I had him over. My wife had an apartment in San Francisco, and the lady we shared a bathroom with another couple, and she just happened to be the sister of Sammy Lee, who won the Olympic diving championship in England those many years ago, won a gold medal. And we became very good friends, and she made a Chinese dinner. She was Korean. And I had both of these guys, Harrison, the one that died on Peleliu, over for dinner. Mm-hmm. And I remember that evening we went out to this big park where the roller coaster was, and they rode this thing, and then they liked the past. I said they'll never do that again, never do it again. But neither one of those fellas made it.
Yeah. I know it's a whole nother story, and I don't want you to go deep into it, but what was the Captain McKay's court-martial? What was that all about? Did you testify?
I was subpoenaed, and at this time I was getting ready to go back to work, and this thing followed me to San Francisco, to our apartment in San Francisco. Then it came back to my parents' house, and then it went back up to Southern Illinois, where I was. And by the time I got it, the first several days had already transpired up there in Washington. So I called, and they said, well, your testimony is over. That is, that part of it. So said, no, we won't be using you. So I think they got enough people to testify, and this was on his behalf. So then the next thing we heard was they flew Hashimoto over here, which was sort of unprecedented.
Right. Yeah, there's pictures in here of
And
him
yeah,
coming over to getting ready for the testimony.
Yep. Yeah. But from then on, it's just what I had read in the papers and everything, and what has transpired since. Yeah. But it was I believe it was a trumped up deal, and of course all of us people. This guy was an astute officer. I was thinking the other day, every day on the bridge, that I was on the bridge, and during general quarters, and I've stood as high as 21 hours at general quarters on the bridge, I watched Admiral Spruance and this captain function as a team. And if this guy was so poor, they didn't say he was, then why would this admiral be even having anything to do with this guy? This guy was stalwart, he was dignified, as was Admiral Spruance. There was a certain amount of class that radiated off of this guy. The previous captain was quite able, sharp little fellow. Johnson was a very, very sharp, but he was gruff. He swore a lot. As a matter of fact, he cursed one of the guys out. There was a projectile that hit us, and a small one that ricocheted from the water and hit us, and one of the boatswains, Coxswain, who I knew later quite well, picked it up, and I was on the bridge, and this Coxswain had this clear down on the quarterdeck. Well, Johnson didn't know what happened, but then they relayed the message that it was a ricochet from a 37 millimeter gun off the beach, and he cursed old Hodgson. He knew Hodgson. Hodgson been on there a long time. Captain knew a lot of these guys, and he cursed him out real good and told him to throw that damn thing over before it blew his stupid head off. And so Hodgson obviously did. But Johnson was rough and tough, but he was good. He was all right. It was a different type of person, different personality. Right. And so I was always afraid of him. I always stayed clear unless I just had to do something. And as a matter of fact, being a bugler, I had to go, and I always got this duty for some reason. Not because I was any better, just because I just happened to be the one that they picked, and I just kept doing it. So when we would have this captain would go by and have inspections, and each bunch of these people, different groups of different division, would line up at attention, and when he came up, I would sound his horn, doo-doo, doo-doo, and he'd go through and look at each one of them. I mean, he'd look them over, and if he had any kind of observations that he would care to make, he was not, he would make them quite freely, not reluctant. So as we came up to this one group, he finally turned and he looked around at me, and I had a trumpet. Now, I'd taken my cornet from boot camp and put it in my locker. It was a cornet, it wasn't a trumpet, but the ship had two trumpets. So I used one of those. And I used it because it sounded better, and the old brass bugle they had, I couldn't keep polished. And I wasn't the only one that was supposed to polish it, but it was a terrible bent up thing. So I wouldn't use it. So Captain Johnson looked back that morning, and I can remember he said, he didn't talk to me. He talked to the first chief boatswain's mate. Chile or something like that was his name, and he called him over and he said, what's he doing with that non-regulated instrument? And I'd already told this chief that the dadgum bugle I had was not worth a damn, and that I would play this thing. I never knew I was going to get into trouble for doing it. And he said, that's not regulation, why is he playing that? And the chief told him that I couldn't keep the other one polished. I had a good story, because I'd already told him. Well, he said, then see that he gets one and get rid of that. Aye, aye, sir. And they did. They got a plastic bugle that was not worth a dime, a plastic one, and a plastic mouthpiece. So when Captain McVeigh came on, he was not this rigid in this particular area. And never did he ever say anything or question it. And we went back to the trumpet. So we didn't use the plastic bugles. But I did. I got to do a lot of things by being a bugler. I got to go, and when we would come into port and somebody wanted a bugler, apparently you just don't find them anyplace. They need them for these honors and everything. So I got to, there was a Vice Admiral Downs died, and I got to go over and sound taps for him. And they'd have some officer would come and pick us up and pick me up, and what they called a gray lady would drive the car there in San Francisco. So I got to go and I sounded, there was a Marine bugler that came to this from someplace. So we sounded taps. I got to go over and commission a ship across at Oakland one time. Just had to sound morning colors. Little simple stuff, they just use a bugler for them. So I got to do all this, and when I queried the fellow that I was under, I said, why is it that some of these other buglers don't get this great opportunity that I'm getting to do this kind of stuff? And he said, well, he said, simply because I want you to do it. That's why. And I didn't feel like I ought to challenge that. So I didn't. But I did. I got to do a lot of those kind of things.
When did Johnson leave and McKay come in?
You know, they were talking about it the other day, but I absolutely don't remember. There's some of those things that, to me, that I just don't remember.
McKay was the captain, though, for the
McVeigh,
mission.
yeah.
McVeigh, excuse me. McVeigh.
Oh yeah, he was a
I
captain.
keep saying McKay, yeah. McVeigh, though, was in charge for the mission taking the bomb
Oh yes.
over and all
Oh
that,
yes.
so it had been
Oh yeah,
prior to
yeah,
that.
yeah. He had several. He was on when the suicide plane hit us,
I see.
and Iwo Jima, and so we made Iwo Jima. Now all this time, you understand, Admiral Spruance was in charge of all this business.
Right.
And the only time that he didn't have an operation and Halsey had it was in the Philippines, which we never made, and also at Peleliu, where I first went to the hospital. Palau group, Palau, P-A-L-A-U or something to that effect,
Right.
that group. There's the island of Babelthorpe there. That's a big long island, which we didn't try to take, but Peleliu was a little island, littler island, and we took it in Anguar, which the Army took or tried to take, and then they had to reinforce them with Marines. And this was in the Palau group. Peleliu is where the little ship Ringness took us to the hospital, and we stayed there a couple of days, and then they put us on the Tranquility hospital ship with all its lights showing,
Right. Yeah.
and ran us from there to Guam, to the base hospital on Guam. Well, I was glad to get off of that thing. It looked like a beautiful, well-lit target. And I was down in the bottom of it in the bunk. So,
Here's a picture of Admiral Nimitz, I guess, on board.
well, yes, I have carried their bags. That was another one of my duties.
You carried
I've carried some of their
big
bags,
guys'
yeah,
bags.
big bags, yeah, I've carried some. I can remember there was an actor came aboard one day, Richard Ney. And he used to be the husband of Greer Garson. And he came aboard, and we had a boatswain mate. Little things I can remember just pop in your head.
Yeah.
But we had a boatswain's mate, or a coxswain. The coxswain and the bugler stood watches on the quarterdeck. And they'd put this watch on the quarterdeck when we were anchored, and any dignitaries came aboard. They came up from a motor whale boat or a admiral's barge, and they would get out on this little platform, walk up this ladder on the side, and step aboard. And Richard Ney came on one day, and I recognized him immediately. And he asked for the coxswain, who was not particularly with us. He said, look, I want you to call Officer so-and-so. And the guy got it all mixed up. And this didn't set well, and Ney got somewhat irritated with him. Now, Nay, I see on television is some kind of a broker in California. I believe
that
it's the same guy, yeah.
Yeah.
But I often thought about that. Old Richard Nay came aboard.
Are you on this boat, the Hollandia?
Yeah, Hollandia, yes.
Hollandia?
Yeah, here. I'll show you a
It
picture.
came, says, he landed in San Diego September 26,
Yeah,
1945. So it was, in all, it was about a 2-month ordeal before you finally got
Oh
back to
yeah,
the States.
yeah. We were there on the hospital, and then all of us that could moved over to the east side into a submarine camp.
Right.
And they were mentioning this the other day. They could remember this,
Yeah.
where they eat. We ate good. They had ice cream all the time, and
I want to look at your book now. If we have time, I'm going to stop.
all right.
Certainly a pleasure.
And that is the remarkable story of Glenn G. Morgan. World War II, veteran U.S. Navy and survivor of the USS Indianapolis. Truly one of the remarkable stories that I've heard, or I imagine you've heard too. Thank you for your service, Glenn Morgan. We lost Glenn Morgan on Christmas Eve of 2012.